This morning, there's so many different passages of Scripture we could look at. I think we can go to 1 Corinthians 13. You can go to the teachings of Jesus. You can go to 1 John. But the bottom line of what we're going to be looking at today is loving hurting people, bearing the burdens of hurting people. In 1 Corinthians 13, he talks about the supremacy of love in the Christian life. And in verse 4, he speaks about how charity is patient, charity is kind, how charity is not thinking about itself, is not arrogant. And when we talk about the issue today, which we're going to be talking about, which is handling the initial disclosure of sexual assault, this requires a tremendous amount of patience, a tremendous amount of grace, and a tremendous amount of humility. This situation has been absolutely butchered in almost every church and every denomination for years, and has resulted in many, many, many people getting hurt needlessly. That being said, I want to kind of back up a little bit before we look at how to love someone who comes to you to disclose something very personal. And just say this, one of the reasons we are doing this is to keep this from ever happening again. One of the reasons we are teaching everyone in the congregation is this: nobody robs gun stores in the middle of the day. Why? Because everybody's got guns. The store owner has guns, the store clerk has guns, everyone has guns, every customer has a gun. You just don't walk in and rob a gun store unless you have a death wish. By the same token, we want our church to be like that. Not that everyone's carrying a gun, but that everyone is a danger to someone who would want to hurt a child and get away with it. That every single person in the church, they have to watch out for, and so they don't come and harm our children. That being said, I'm fully aware, and what we're talking about this morning, that not every single one of you is going to be someone who is equipped and willing to or able to counsel someone through the depths of this. However, as we're talking about this, there is a very high chance that you may have someone disclose to you some form of sexual assault, even if you are a teenager. Because as we're going to see, people who are hurting like that are going to be looking for anyone who they can trust and listen to. So what I'm going to equip you with this morning is how to respond to that initially. We're not expecting you to be the one that counsels somebody for 5 years. What we are asking is that you be aware so that if someone trusts you enough to disclose these type of things, that you would be aware of how to respond, or more importantly, how not to respond. So when we talk about loving someone through this, if you're following along at home, the chapter that you're to read or the video you're supposed to watch was phenomenal. It was very, very good. The problem is we don't understand so much of why they tell us the way we're supposed to respond. What I'm going to do this morning may be a little difficult for you to hear. We're not going to go into graphic detail or anything, but what we're going to do is explain what it is like to be a child raised in a church, and how the most innocuous basic Christian teachings are weaponized against someone to abuse them. Okay? And then from there, we will understand how to better love someone when they finally have the courage to disclose what has happened to them. So let's say that you are just a normal, innocent child being raised in church. You are taught that there is a God. You are taught about heaven. You are taught about hell. You are taught about the fear of God. You are talked to about judgment. You are told about sin. You are told to hate sin, to fear God, to run from judgment. You are told about forgiveness and the necessity for you as a Christian to forgive. Okay? And these are the things that are there that are being taught. You're taught to honor and obey those who are in authority over you. You are taught to honor and obey your parents, your aunts, your uncles, the leaders of the church. You're taught to submit to your Sunday school teacher. You're taught to submit to the choir director, the youth pastor. You're taught to honor and obey anyone working in the youth group, because they may be a college student or they may be another adult that's helping. And so you are raised with this kind of all authorities kind of fit together. Okay? And you are supposed to be, as a good Christian person, obedient and submissive to the authorities over you. And again, what I'm saying here is not to knock any of these teachings. I just want to show you how they are twisted. Because remember, Satan quotes Scripture. Satan quotes Scripture when he tempts Jesus. And the same deception is used to harm children. So you go on from there. And you learn about submitting to and obeying authority. You hear stories about gossip and being a talebearer, and you learn those stories about how we're not supposed to gossip. We're not supposed to be, going around spreading lies about people. We learn those type of things. And subtly we may hear some digs on the government, okay, where we're taught to really submit to our parents, but our parents may make some negative comments about the government, negative comments about the police, or negative comments about some politician, and that's not necessarily a big thing, but it's something that kind of formulates in our mind, where we don't have as much of a trust for, say, DCF or police, and this is going to vary from congregation, family to family. From there, as you get older, you're taught about sexual purity. You're taught about, how sexual sin is wrong. And unfortunately, many churches, as we teach about sexual purity, we begin to really instill within young people that you can be damaged goods that nobody wants. I don't know if you've ever heard sexual purity taught that way. I remember when I was in high school hearing a guy preach a sermon on nobody wants to buy a used car. And then he went and talked about how girls could be used cars, and guys want to know how many guys kissed them and touched them and all those type of things. And those type of teachings are very prevalent as we try to tell people to be sexually pure. And so there's a lot of fear that if you are not sexually pure, that you are not going to be wanted, that no guy is going to date you, or no girl is going to want to marry you. And if you're not sexually pure, then you'll have to be single the rest of your life because nobody's going to want you. And then there's terms that are used, and you're called loose and those type of things. From there, you're taught things on modesty, where if you don't dress a particular way, then you as a woman are a stumbling block to the man. If you don't act a certain way, then you are causing him to sin. And it's taught in such a manner to where the sin is always on behalf of the woman, never on behalf of the man. And so it's always the woman's fault. If your skirt is too short, then he is going to lust after you. If you rub elbows with him, then you're going to give him horrible thoughts. If you're wearing pants, then he's going to be lusting after you. If you were wearing shorts, and again, what was good teaching on modesty can very quickly become weaponized by the wrong person. And so what happens is you are raised learning all of these things. And that's normal. It's part of who you are. Now, let's stop for a minute and let's leave that aside, and let's now ask, if you were going to rob a bank, what would you do? You would case the joint. You may try to become a police officer so nobody would suspect that you're the one that robbed the bank. You may become a worker at the bank. Why? So that you can have access to the funds. You may go to the bank. You may sit outside and keep times or when the money truck comes, and you may keep tabs on how often the police go by. You may walk in, look around, see where all the security cameras are. Why? Well, because if you rob the bank, you don't want to get caught. And if you do rob the bank, and you are worried about getting caught, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be coming up with an alibi. You're going to be coming up with a way to blame someone else. You're going to be doing anything you can to cast any doubt on the fact that you're the one that raised the bank. Now let me just ask a simple question. You don't have to raise your hand because I know what you're going to say. If you had the choice between being a registered sex offender for the rest of your life or spending 3 years in jail for bank robbery, which would you choose? Every one of you would choose 3 years in jail for bank robbery. So why would we think that someone who is going to molest a child would be less cautious and less manipulative and less planning than someone who is going to rob a bank. You see, wolves come, Jesus tells us, in sheep's clothing. That's the way they come. I know we know the creepy van with spray-painted free candy on the side is what we all think of when we think of child molesters. But if you go and look who they are, they're youth pastors, they're deacons, they're public school teachers, they're coaches, okay? They're aunts, they're uncles, they're babysitters, and they come presenting themselves as wonderful people. Why? Because if you want to rob a bank, you don't walk in, hand them your ID, and say, "This is me, give me all your money," because you get caught. So what happens when someone is going to harm a child, and whether this is in a conscious thought or a subconscious thought, what they do is they begin to groom. And part of that grooming process is becoming trusted by authority figures in that child's life. That is, they come to church. They begin to spend time with the pastor and the elders and the deacons and the parents. And they come and they know all of the lingo. They're very astute in the Bible. They're very good at what they do. And what they do is they begin to earn trust. Now this does two things. It gives them an alibi if they ever get caught, because people aren't going to believe that they would do things. But not only that, it gives the child the impression that they are a trustworthy authority figure. From here, they begin to put themselves in a position of authority and trust, and then from there, they begin to groom the individual. Okay, and I know this is very hard to talk about, but you need to be aware of this so that when someone discloses to you or hints at that something's happening to them, that you know what to do. And I know this is very hard to talk about. What they will begin to do is they will begin to see if that child will keep secrets. Okay, they will begin to tell them things and see if they will divulge it to others. Many times in a lighthearted, joking manner about the most innocuous things, because they want to see if they'll keep a secret. From there, it's not just keeping secrets. They begin to push boundaries. They begin to put mistrust in other authority figures. They begin to instill within the child that no one will believe you. And they may even go to the authority figure, like the parents, and distort a story so that the parents may have some doubt about the truthfulness of their child. I mean, let's be honest, as parents, we know that our kids are sinful. And if a Sunday school teacher came to me and said, "You know, your son's telling some pretty tall tales in Sunday school," almost every single one of us is going to believe the Sunday school teacher. Why? Because they're an adult. But what can happen is that can happen in the genuine, wonderful Sunday school teacher who loved her child, but you can also have someone who is seeking to manipulate that child. And what they will do is they will begin to isolate that child from their parents, from their siblings, from other figures of authority. Okay? They will begin to do so. And again, this is how it's so hard to tell, because I've had this happen with me personally. Because a person who's abusing someone will come with them for counseling. Well, let me ask you this. Wouldn't you be scared to go to counseling by yourself? So wouldn't it be wonderful if your dad came with you? Absolutely. But at the same time, if the dad is abusing the child, he may come so the child doesn't disclose the abuse. And that may not just be a father, that may be a friend. And what they're doing is they're making it where that child has no outlet, has no voice, has no one to speak to. And then they begin to push boundaries. And as they push boundaries, they fall back on religious terms. Things that we just talked about at the very beginning. Things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you tempted me." Again, blaming the child for what they did. Okay, you know, you've got to forgive me. And because if you don't, you can't be a Christian if you don't forgive me for what I've done. And then they do things like, and remember, we can't gossip about these things. And then if they're a spiritual authority, and this is documented many times over, they will say things like this: you know what would happen if you told people what I did, what you made me do, is hundreds of people would go to hell because I wouldn't be able to preach anymore. Okay, you would destroy our church. Okay, the ministry couldn't go forward because if you disclose these things, okay, and so they use the language of forgiveness. If you tell your parents about this, you're not being a forgiving person. And you know what Jesus says about forgiving? They use the language of authority. Okay, they use all of these things to keep the individual from speaking out. They will try to make the sin not really a sin. Abraham had many wives. My wife's sick. What I'm telling you, by the way, is actual real statements from people who've been caught abusing children. Abraham had many wives, and he was a godly man. Okay? You are God's gift to me for my service to him. This is the way that fill in the blank shows love for those who are special. This is a special relationship that others don't get to enjoy. My wife's sick, and one day she's going to die, and when she does, I'm going to marry you. So this is okay. And I know that this is sick. I know it's hard to hear. But what happens then to the victim is they become confused. Why? Because the most godly person they know is doing the most ungodly thing they've ever experienced. But the abuser is using Scripture to justify what they are doing. And you have a child who doesn't understand why Abraham and Hagar was bad. They just know that Abraham had Hagar. And all of a sudden, all of these things are being pressed upon the child, the victim. And it may not even be a child. It may be an adult. Why? To keep them from speaking out. To keep them from having anyone they could speak to further isolate them, to further confuse them. So they then begin to tell them things like, if you disclose this and everybody finds out, there's not going to be a man that's going to want to marry you because you're a used car now. Okay? No guy wants used goods. If you tell people this, you'll be single and nobody will want you. They will use things like, well, the way you were dressed, this is your fault. You made me do this to you. Because you were dressed inappropriately, because you gave me a hug, you're the one that caused me to do this to you. And so what it does is it fills the victim with guilt and with shame on purpose. Why? To keep them from disclosing what is actually happening to them. Now, let's take someone like that and let's put them in our church. Okay? Let's just say that they're sitting 2 rows in front of Bob. There's nobody there right now, but let's say they're sitting 2 rows in front of Bob. And they now see their abuser come up and read Scripture, preach. They see them walk up to me and see me smile and shake their hand, give them a hug. They see other people in the church greet them. What do you think is going through their mind when the abuser is shaking my hand and turns and winks at them? They can't talk to me. Why? Because we're on the same team. And you don't even notice that when that person's shaking your hand. You don't even notice that when that person is giving you a hug or greeting you. You are just being a regular Christian. But that's what the wolf does, so that they may have access to the sheep. So let's say that child there begins to see, okay, what my abuser is telling me is true. No one will believe me. Even if someone would believe me, I don't have the opportunity to speak to someone, because even if I went to speak to someone, my abuser is going to be there to help and make sure I'm okay. I can't trust the cops because I've heard of how bad they are my whole life, and I've heard how bad DCF is, and so I can't call them. And it's really all my fault to begin with. I'm the one that caused this godly man to do these things. I'm the one that did all these things, and if I was to disclose it, nothing would happen to him, but it would just ruin my life. No one would look at me the same way. No one would ever love me again. No one would ever want me again. Okay? That's what happens. So, this is why we have to be very careful what we say when someone begins to disclose to us very personal things. Let me tell you some responses I've heard. There was a parent whose child was molested by a ministry leader who was very prominent, okay, known worldwide. Okay, everybody knew his name. He was very, very, very prominent. And the daughter had enough courage to tell her mother, and this is what the mother responded with: "Don't you ruin that godly man's reputation by lying and gossiping about him. You know he didn't do that to you." Now, let me just tell you a little bit about abusers. They don't have one victim. They don't. And what can happen is many times there's one opening, and if you slam the door on that opening, that victim will be silent. And not only will they continue to be victimized, but that abuser will go on to have upwards in the hundreds of victims, continuously preying on the weak, putting themselves in a position, and they'll get there. It's just like a bank robber. You rob one bank and you get away with it, and nobody knows who did it. You're going to rob another one. But can you imagine if you robbed a bank and the bank never disclosed they were robbed, and it was never on the news? You begin to feel that you could walk in and take all the money and walk right out and nobody'd ever know. So it's very important when someone begins to disclose very personal, hurtful things that we don't slam the door. Let me tell you another way the door was slammed. There was a young lady dealing with a very prominent ministry leader, and she went to the board of directors that was supposed to hold them accountable. Okay? And she said, "This is what the ministry leader did to me." They responded with Matthew 18. Matthew 18, "You shouldn't be talking to us. That's gossip and slander. You need to go alone with him, one-on-one, and no one else there, and confront him with what you think he did." And they threw the Bible in her face. The guy went on to molest a ton of others. Listen, when someone comes to you, the most important thing you can do is keep the door of communication open. They are getting ready to disclose the hardest thing they've ever talked about in their entire life. And you need to do everything you can to let them talk and keep them talking. What happens is many times we are floored because it's our biological brother, it's our child, it's our father, it's our friend we've known for 20 years, and that's the name that they put out. And so our response is, "So-and-so? No, so-and-so could never do that." And what you've just done is you've confirmed what they told you, what they told the victim, and that is no one will believe you. In fact, they will call you a liar. So what you have to do is you have to listen. None of this, again, we'll talk about false accusations in a minute. But there is no way that couldn't happen. You cannot, under any circumstances, say that. Are there false accusations? One, they're extremely rare. Extremely rare. But two, even if it is a false accusation, you need to get all the information you can so that you can prove it's a false accusation. I had a young man when I was a youth pastor who gave a false accusation. Very clearly, obviously a false accusation. Okay? And I won't go into all the details of it, but it was very clearly a false accusation. But he did come from a messed up home. There's always that 1% chance that he's not lying. Okay? There's always that chance that what he's telling me is true. So what I did, and this is something that you can do, is you listen and you tell them this: no one should ever do that to a child. You're not saying you're a liar. You're not saying I don't believe you. What you are saying is, in essence, if what you're telling me is true, that should be condemned. And so you say, no one, whether a father, a pastor, a music minister, no one should ever do that to you or any child. Thank you for having the courage to tell me that. Now we'll talk about referring that to the police and all that in just a minute. But you never respond with, you know what, there's no way that so-and-so did that. Are you sure they did that? I can't believe that. Because what you're doing is, if there is a chance that and I'm telling you, when you look at percentages, there's a 95% chance they're telling you the truth. It's extremely rare that someone wants to come forward, especially in a church culture where they believe they're going to be ostracized and single the rest of their life and seen as damaged goods. It's very rare that someone's going to come forward and say, hey, so-and-so touched me inappropriately, when they've been told their whole life that'll make you damaged goods and nobody will want you. Never close the door. Okay? One of the next things you need to do when someone talks to you and they begin to disclose it is you do not need to know details. You should never ask, where did he touch you? You don't. Okay? It doesn't matter how far it went. Non-consensual is non-consensual. Period. You do not.
It's not consensual, period.
And with a child, it's not consensual, period. Okay? You don't need to know. You are not a police officer. You are not going to be conducting an investigation. You are someone that someone thought they could trust enough with that private information. And this is why it's important for everyone in the congregation to know that. Because you know what? A 12-year-old girl may disclose what happened to her to a friend. That may be the only person that they think they can trust. And let's just be honest. If you were going to begin to disclose some of the most hurtful things that have ever happened to you, wouldn't you stick your toe in the water before you jumped in? And if they begin with saying, you know, my uncle really makes me uncomfortable, and you go, why? He's a godly man. Do you think they're really going to tell you why he makes them uncomfortable? No, you listen. You encourage them. You thank them for talking to you. Okay? Don't slam the door. Don't express doubt. Don't in any way, shape, or form communicate anything other than I believe you and I appreciate what you're telling me. Next. We need to be very concerned with with how comfortable that individual is. So I'm going to just tell you some things that you need to be aware of. I used to counsel people, and my rule was I'm not going to counsel any woman alone because I don't want to be falsely accused of doing something. I have since changed, and that is I will not counsel a woman alone, because many of the women I counsel, the last time they were alone with a man, he abused them. And I do not want a woman or a child to feel uncomfortable talking to me. So what I do is I make sure that someone else is there. Okay, we don't think this way, but you need to. You don't sit between them and the door. You don't close the door unless they ask for the door to be closed. You ask them, are you comfortable? Do you feel safe? Why? Because if they are sitting in a room and I walk in the room by myself, close the door, and sit in front of the door, what do you think that's going to trigger in them? No matter how innocent I may be, I have to be concerned about them and their well-being. From my perspective, I would want to have a private conversation. But from their perspective, they may want the door open. I've counseled people sitting in the front yard of the church, because if that makes them comfortable to know they can get up and run, then I will sit there and talk them where they can get up and run. Okay? For you women especially, this is important. When a child discloses that to you, most women's initial response is you want to run up to that child and you want to give them a hug. Please hear me. One of the problems with this subject is that child has never had the opportunity to say no when someone wanted to touch them. You give them the opportunity to say no. You don't run up to them and give them a hug. You tell them, my heart is broken with what you're telling me. Would you be okay with me giving you a hug? Why? Because the person that abused them never asked, is this okay? And one of the things that has happened to that victim is their voice has been taken from them. Their bodily autonomy has been taken from them. And one of the things you have to do as a Christian who follows the law of love, who loves your neighbor as yourself, is you have to let them know they have the right to not be touched. And if they don't want a hug, all they have to do is say no. And if they want a hug, all they have to do is say yes. And you will respect their body and not touch them if they don't want to be touched. It's very important. Because from our perspective, when someone's crying, especially a child, what do? You run up to them and you give them a hug. But we have to restore their right to say no. It's very important. This is how we love hurting people. So we got to make sure that they know that they're believed. We don't ask a bunch of probing questions as to, well, how far did they go, those type of things. It doesn't matter. Okay? We want to make sure that we respect their comfort. A good question to ask would be, would you be more comfortable talking if someone else was here? And then let them pick the person. Why? Because you may pick someone that knows, or you may pick someone who's abused them. Are you comfortable talking here, or would you rather go somewhere else? Would you rather my wife be here or someone else? And then you let them pick who is there. Because again, we want them to know that they are not going to be further harmed by us, that we love them, and we want to bring an end to the hurt that is being done to them. One of the things you're going to find if someone ever discloses this type of information to you is it's not going to make sense. Why? Okay? How many of y'all have ever been through a traumatic event? Sudden, unexpected loss of a loved one, massive car wreck, major surgery. Okay? How many of y'all have a perfect recollection of everything that happened? You don't. I know of people who've lost a child unexpectedly and they can't remember anything that happened that day. Others have that happen and they can tell you everything that happened that day. When you go through trauma, your body gets overloaded to where you can't remember everything that took place because your body's not made. You were created to enjoy God forever. You were not created to be molested. And when that happens, especially with all of the lies of the abuser and all of the things that they say, your mind is so warped and so twisted and so confused. When they'll disclose one thing here, and they'll disclose something there, and they'll disclose something in the middle, and then they'll go back before it. And our job is not to piece together a timeline. You're not a detective. You're not an investigator. You're a Christian who is to love hurting people. Okay? There's going to be a detective who will piece together the timeline. And it's going to be extremely traumatic for them. You want to be the person who is there after all of that trauma, that they know they can run to, okay, because you love them. That's all we are supposed to do as a church, okay? We'll get to disclosure to police and all that in just a minute. So in that, they're going to be confused. In fact, they may disclose what was done to them and laugh. I've had that. They may cry. They may show no emotion at all. And our job is not to perceive based upon their emotion. Okay, I've had someone who disclosed to me horrific sexual assault and laughed after it. And I remember going, that's so bizarre. But here's the truth. Their emotions have been so overloaded that you either laugh or you crawl in a hole and die. They don't know how to handle it. Okay, your mind, your body, your emotions, your physiological, everything is so messed up that you don't know how to respond. And that is where one of the things we respond to when we speak truth in these situations is you have to tell them that God does not approve of what was done to them and that God hates it. I have listened to people disclose what happened to them and started crying because it hurts so much to hear. And them start saying, it's okay. It's okay. And I tell them repeatedly, it is not okay. It is not okay. And it is never okay for someone to do what they did to you. And that is something that you need to disclose. God hates what was done to you. It is not okay. It is wrong. It is evil. You cannot in any way, shape, or form try to diminish it. Okay? Now, and you can get mad at me, but this is the truth. Now is not the time to talk about forgiveness. Now is not the time to talk about turning the other cheek. When someone discloses those things, it is time for you to love them. They don't need a lecture on forgiveness. They already got it from their abuser, who weaponized Scripture to buy their silence. It's true. They were already told by the person that molested them, you have to forgive me or God will send you to hell. And when you turn around and say the same thing, you're repeating the same lies. Is forgiveness going to come? Yes, forgiveness is going to come. But now's not the time to talk about that. This is the first time someone has opened up. Have you ever, there's a comedian that came out with a phrase called Jesus juked. Have you ever been Jesus juked? Jesus juked is when you're pouring your heart out to someone and they just throw out a Bible verse and like, Jesus, ha ha. No. When you are pouring out the deepest hurts of your soul is not the time for someone to lecture you on submission to your parents. It's the time to shut your mouth and love them. There are other times to talk about those things. Okay, you do realize that Jesus was God and that Jesus knew every sin about every single person he ever met. And yet we find him speaking specifically to the Pharisees, specifically to the woman at the well. But how often do we find Jesus when the woman runs up to touch him to be healed from the issue of blood, turn around and say, you disobeyed your parents when you were 7 years old. You're not very submissive to your husband. You need to submit more. Well, we don't find that. Did he know all those sins? Yes. What did he do? He had compassion. He had compassion on the hurting. There will come a time through the course of their healing when all of the things about forgiveness and everything else will be addressed by someone else. Your job is to be the person who loves them. Okay? Affirm that what was done is wrong and evil. Tell them that they are welcome to speak with you more, that you are always there for them. And this is where we begin to go to, okay, well, what do I do now? Okay, we know what not to do. We don't close the door in their face. We don't lecture them. We don't judge them. We listen. We show the love of Christ to them. Then what do? Our first priority is their physical safety. You say, well, what about their soul? We'll get to that in just a minute. Remember, there are times that Jesus fed people before he shared the gospel with them. There are times when Jesus saved the disciples from drowning before he taught them Scripture. When a child at Awana's discloses to you what happened, you can't put them back in the car with their abuser and send them home. You can't. You cannot do that. So you have to ask questions like, well, can you tell me who did this to you? Okay? I just want to make sure that you're safe. We can't have this happening again. You are too precious in the eyes of God. You are loved too much by God for us to put you back in that situation. Okay? Do you feel safe going home? Do you feel safe getting a ride from this person? Okay? Would you rather me give you a ride? Would you rather come stay at my home or another home? We will find you a place to stay where you are safe. Okay? If you don't feel comfortable going home with that person, all you have to do is say so, and I will make sure that that does not happen. Why? When was the last time someone gave them the option of escaping the pain and suffering they're in? No, we want to make sure that they're safe. Okay? Now, after all of that, you need to, one, you need to contact the police. Okay? There is a tendency for people, when they have this disclosed, to go and talk with church leaders. We're going to get to that in just a minute. But what do you know, or how is that going to go if the church leaders are involved and aware of the abuse? This has happened before, where someone has been abused, and so they go and tell someone who's in on it. It's happened. I know of a church where the pastor molested a bunch of kids. We're talking dozens of children. The parents went to the associate pastor as opposed to the police. And he told them, he's a godly man. If you go to the police with this, it will destroy the reputation of the church. It will destroy the gospel. What they should have done is gone to the police. Now, if you have never filed a police report or never called the child abuse hotline or whatever, there is nothing wrong with asking for help. There's nothing wrong with saying, who do I call? I've had people come up to me and say, who do I call? I heard, so-and-so disclosed this to me. Who do I call? We'd be more than happy to. But you need to be very careful, because normally abusers have ingratiated themselves with people in authority. And many times that umbrella of authority cooperates together to cover up the abuse. So you need to be resolved that if you go to a church leader and say, would you help me file a police report, and they are hesitant to do so or try to talk you out of it, you need to be resolved to file one anyway. Because what has happened over the years, this is what happened in the Catholic Church. A priest would molest a child. The child would then disclose that to the cardinal. The cardinal would tell them, don't do anything about it, and move the priest to another place to have more access to children. I'm here to tell you, I will help you call and report abuse anytime, night or day. I'll be more than happy to help you with that. But if anyone tries to stop you, you need to know they're complicit in it. That being said, you then need to help that child find some type of professional help, okay, or that adult, whether that is a pastor or another counselor or something along those lines, that you don't just leave that with, thank you for telling me that, have a nice day. No, are you safe? Okay, do you need a place to stay? Do you need a ride? Okay, is the person who hurt you, are they going to be at your home this week? Okay. You then go and you file a police report and you find someone that can give that child professional help. Some of you may get to the point where you feel this is a ministry that you want, and you may become the professional help that counsels the victim. We as a church are not expecting everyone to be there. But what we are expecting is if someone discloses this stuff to you, that you handle it the right way. And I'm going to be honest with you, the chances of someone disclosing this to you, even as a teenager, is probably higher than them disclosing it to me. Why? Because if there is an abuser, they're going to do everything they can to keep that person from going to someone in a position of authority. Okay? One other thing that I want to mention to you as parents is I understand we all have shy children. I understand that. And I understand part of raising our children is to teach them to be friendly, to shake hands, etc. But if you have a child that does not want to hug someone, don't make them. Okay? Again, it's different when you got, like a little, my little Charity doesn't like anybody. Okay? She doesn't. And nobody but brothers and sisters. That being said, okay, with one of my older children, if they run up and hug all the older people in the church, but there's a man in the church they don't want to give a hug to, they're not going to. If you have a child that comes to you and says, I'm not comfortable around that person, then don't make them be around that person. Tell them thank you for letting me know. And we'll make sure that you're not around them. Okay, when you figure out why, or is there a reason why you're not comfortable, and then you work through that. One of the things you've got to do, though, is you've got to make sure your children know that their body is their body, not someone else's. Okay? I know this is very heavy. I know there's a lot we talked about today. Was there any questions or comments today on this? All right. Before we close in prayer, it is extremely important that we as a church get this right. I hope that none of you ever have anyone disclose anything to you, because I hope that no one ever has anything happen to them. However, if someone does begin to talk about those things, we've got to handle in a way that shows that person the love of Jesus Christ. Bob, can you close in prayer?